Book of the Marvels of the World or Description of the World. In Italian Il Milione or Oriente Poliano, and in English commonly called the Travels of Marco Polo, is a 13th-century travelogue written down by Rustichello da Pisa from stories told by Marco Polo, describing Polo's travels through Asia between 1276 and 1291, and his experiences at the court of Kublai Khan. The book was written in Old French by Romance writer Rustichello da Pisa, who worked from accounts which he had heard from Marco Polo when they were imprisoned together in Genoa. From the beginning, there has been incredulity over Polo's sometimes fabulous stories, as well as a scholarly debate in recent times. Some have questioned whether Marco had actually traveled to China or was just repeating stories that he had heard from other travelers. Supporters of the book's basic accuracy have replied. Economic historian Mark Elvin concludes that recent work demonstrates by specific example after specific example the ultimately overwhelming probability of the broad authenticity of Polo's account, and that the book is, in essence, authentic, and, when used with care, in broad terms to be trusted as a serious though obviously not always final witness. History. The source of the title Il Milione is debated. One view is that it comes from the Polo family's use of the name Emilian to distinguish themselves from the numerous other Venetian families bearing the name Polo. A more common view is that the name refers to medieval reception of the travelogue, namely that it was full of a million lies. Modern assessments of the text usually consider it to be the record of an observant rather than imaginative or analytical traveler. Marco Polo emerges as being curious and tolerant, and devoted to Kublai Khan and the dynasty that he served for 2 decades. The book is Polo's account of his travels to China, which he calls Cathay and Manji. The Polo party left Venice in 1271. They left China in late 1290 or early 1291 and were back in Venice in 1295. The tradition is that Polo dictated the book to a Romance writer, Rustichello da Pisa, while in prison in Genoa between 1298 to 1299. Rustichello may have worked up his first Franco-Italian version from Marco's notes. The book was then named Devisement du Monde and Livre des Merveilles du Monde in French, and De Mirabilibus Mundi in Latin. Contents. The Travels is divided into 4 books. Book 1 describes the lands of the Middle East and Central Asia that Marco encountered on his way to China. Book 2 describes China and the court of Kublai Khan. Book 3 describes some of the coastal regions of the East. Japan, India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and the east coast of Africa. Book 4 describes some of the then recent wars among the Mongols and some of the regions of the far north, like Russia. Legacy. The Travels was a rare popular success in an era before printing. The impact of Polo's book on cartography was delayed. The first map in which some names mentioned by Polo appear was in the Catalan Atlas of Charles V, which included 30 names in China and a number of other Asian toponyms. In the mid-15th century, the cartographer of Murano, Fra Mauro, meticulously included all of Polo's toponyms in his 1450 map of the world. Marco Polo's description of the Far East and its riches inspired Christopher Columbus's decision to try to reach Asia by sea, in a westward route. A heavily annotated copy of Polo's book was among the belongings of Columbus. Polo's writings included descriptions of cannibals and spice growers. Subsequent versions. Marco Polo was accompanied on his trips by his father and uncle, though neither of them published any known works about their journeys. The book was translated into many European languages in Marco Polo's own lifetime, but the original manuscripts are now lost. The oldest surviving Polo manuscript is in Old French, heavily flavored with Italian, for Luigi Foscolo Benedetto. This text is the basic original text, which he corrected by comparing it with the somewhat more detailed Italian of Ramusha. together with a Latin manuscript in the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana. Other early important sources are R and Z. Another Old French polo manuscript, dating to around 1350, is held by the National Library of Sweden. A total of about 150 copies in various languages are known to exist. During copying and translating, many errors were made, so there are many differences between the various copies. The first English translation is the Elizabethan version by John Frampton, the most noble and famous Travels of Marco Polo, based on Santilla's Castilian translation of 1503. The first attempt to collate manuscripts and provide a critical edition was in a volume of collected travel narratives printed at Venice in 1559. The editor, Giovanbattista Ramuscia, collated manuscripts from the first part of the 14th century, which he considered to be perfettamente corretto. He was of the opinion, not shared by modern scholars, that Marco had first written in Latin, quickly translated into Italian. He had apparently been able to use a Latin version, of marvelous antiquity, lent him by a friend in the Gizzi family of Venice. The edition of Benedetto, Marco Polo, Il Milione, under the patronage of the Comitato Geografico Nazionale Italiano, collated 60 additional manuscript sources, in addition to some 80 that had been collected by Henri Ewell, for his 1871 edition. It was Benedetto who identified Rustichello da Pisa as the original compiler or amanuensis, and his established text has provided the basis for many modern translations, his own in Italian, and Aldo Ricci's The Travels of Marco Polo. A.C. Moll and Paul Pelliot published a translation under the title Description of the World that uses manuscript F as its base and attempts to combine the several versions of the text into one continuous narrative while at the same time indicating the source for each section. ISBN 4871873,080. An introduction to Marco Polo is Leonard Olchka, Marco Polo's Asia. An introduction to his Description of the World called Il Milione, translated by John A. Scott 1960. It had its origins in the celebrations of the 700th anniversary of Marco Polo's birth. Other travelers. Although Marco Polo was certainly the most famous, he was not the only nor the first European traveler to the Mongol Empire that subsequently wrote an account of his experiences. Other 13th-century European travelers who journeyed to the court of the Great Khan were André de Longjumeau, William of Rubruck and Giovanni da Pia del Carpine with Benedict Pollack. None of them visited China except Marco Polo. The Moroccan merchant Ibn Battuta traveled through the Golden Horde and China subsequently in the early to mid-14th century. The 14th-century English author John de Mandeville wrote an account of journeys in the East, but this was probably based on second-hand information and contains much apocryphal information.